大家好，对了，从这节课开始，我就基本上不讲汉语，我想用全英文给大家授课。So, from this class, I'm going to try and use only English to teach this class. If you all listen carefully, I'm sure you can follow what I'm going to be saying. Today, what I want you to do is to achieve two things. First of all, get a broad overview of the content of this story, but more importantly, I want you to learn how to tell this story succinctly. What does succinctly mean? Well, another word for succinctly is concisely. Succinct, concise. What do these words mean? They mean basically being short and brief. I want to teach you how to tell this story in as few words as possible. Why do I want to teach you that? Well, first of all, it would be good if you got a vague overview of the whole story before you dive into the detailed language work in the next class. But more importantly than that, if you're chatting to a foreigner and you want to tell them a little bit more about Chinese culture, you're not going to be able to stand there for 10 minutes and tell them a story. In the cut and thrust of a conversation, you may just want to mention a story. You may want to talk about the Plum Blossom story and let that foreigner quickly understand it in just a couple of sentences. Because if you start taking out a book and reading the whole story, you might send the foreigner to sleep, or they might interrupt you halfway through and then they've never really heard the story. So when we're talking to foreign friends, it can be really, really important to think about how I get the core information that I want to convey across in the quickest, simplest, and most vivid way. And that's what we're going to be trying to do in this class. Now, before we dive into what we're going to say, how are we going to talk about the plum blossom in simple, concise English, let's think a little bit about story structure. There's been a lot of people much, much cleverer than me who've written lots and lots of things about how stories are structured. But I'm going to talk about it in fairly simple terms. Stories start, of course, with a beginning. And in that beginning part of the story, we need to let our listener and our reader, if it's a written story, or listener, if it's a spoken story, understand the basic background information they need to know in order to get their mind into the right place to follow the story. Then we begin to tell the story. And sometimes when we talk about the beginning of telling the story, we talk about that as like climbing up a hill. It's setting the story up. But then you're probably wondering, what's at the top of the hill? At the top of the hill is, we can call it the climax of the story, the main point of the story, or the thing that makes this story interesting. And then the story starts to climb down the other side of the hill. Because often with the main point, there's some kind of a problem or an issue, and that problem or issue will end up being solved in the story. And in lots of the stories we're going to be telling in this series, you'll see that. You'll see people are faced with a problem, they're faced with a difficulty, and then they come up with a solution to that problem. And then as the solution to that problem develops, we call that the climbing down the hill, the descent from the climax. There's a very posh French word that we use to talk about the very end of a story, which is dénouement, which is where finally all the loose ends and threads of the story are joined together and tied up nicely. A bit like if you're wrapping a present and you tie a bow at the end. So, let's think about the Plum Blossom story. What basic background information do people need to know before you begin to tell the story? Well, first of all, they need to get a rough idea of when this story happened. They need to know this isn't a story that happened last year, or this isn't a story that happened in the modern world. They also need to know where the story happened. They need to know this isn't a story that happened in America, or this isn't a story that happened in Montenegro, or Serbia, or the Republic of Chad. They need to know where the story happened. So, those two pieces of information, the when and the where are really, really important to include in the first sentence of your summary. But I'm actually not going to make a whole sentence of that. I'm going to put those two pieces of information in the first half of the first sentence of my summary. Let's listen to it. During the Western Han Dynasty. Now you might say to me, hey, I've only mentioned the time there. 我刚才不是说了是发生在西汉朝. Now you might say, I've only mentioned the time, but by saying the Han Dynasty, in fact, I'm also giving away the place, because there was only one place in the whole world that had a Han Dynasty. So, first half of the first sentence, during the Western Han Dynasty. Now we need to think a little bit more. What further information do we need to let people know? Now, a historian who's really researched Chinese history, as soon as they hear Western Han Dynasty, they might have all kinds of impressions and images about that period, and they might immediately start to think about some of the things that are going on. But if you're just telling this story to a foreign friend who might not be that familiar with Chinese history, you're going to need to let them know a little bit more about this time period, but particularly what in this time period relates to our story. So think for a moment, what is the important background to the story of Wang Zhaojun? Well, basically the important background is that we have these two nations. We have the Han nation and we have the Xiongnu nation. The Han nation occupying the center of China and the Xiongnu occupying regions far to the west and to the north on the border of the Han. But there's a more important thing than that. We also need to know not just that there are these two nations, but that these two nations are not friendly with each other, or at least when the story begins, they are in a state of more or less constant warfare. There are periods of peace, but mostly the two nations are looking at each other with hostility. So in the second part of our sentence, we're going to need to elaborate on the where and the when and tell our audience more about the background. So I'm going to do it in this way. There was constant warfare between the Han and the Xiongnu. So that's the second half of my first sentence. Okay, so now I'm going to read the whole of the first sentence. During the Western Han Dynasty, there was constant warfare between the Han and the Xiongnu. So in that first sentence, as you see, we have covered the when of the story, the where of the story, and we've also given the most relevant piece of background information without which the rest of the story won't be easy to understand. Now, moving on from there, we need to say that, yes, the Han and the Xiongnu were at war, but that at this time they wanted peace. That gives the story its overall structure, the purpose, the problem that this story is there to try to solve. So the first half of my second sentence is going to be, in order to coexist peacefully. So you see there we're saying that it's not just that they're at war, but that they want peace. The Han and the Xiongnu want peace. There's a problem and it needs a solution. And then we can dive into the more specific part of the story that really helps to launch this story. And so I'm going to say, the Xiongnu leader, Kan Huanye, asked Emperor Yuan to marry one of his daughters. Okay, so let's now listen to that whole sentence all together. In order to coexist peacefully, the Xiongnu leader, Kan Huanye, asked Emperor Yuan to marry one of his daughters. Now, if you think, once we've finished that second sentence, we've not only given background and begun the story, but we've also set up in the audience's mind a problem. The audience can immediately see that arranging a marriage between two nations, two peoples that are hostile to each other, is in itself going to be a problem. So now let's dive into the third sentence. The emperor agreed to this request, but instead of his daughter, he planned to choose a palace maid to marry the Xiongnu leader. Now, in that sentence, there's not a huge amount of development of the story, but it's giving a necessary piece of extra information. But in the fourth sentence, a further problem is established. We've already had a hint that this is going to be difficult. We know that these two nations are at war, and there's been a request for a marriage between the two nations. But now, in this fourth sentence, we get to the real nub of the issue. However, no one was willing to go to a foreign land which was far away and freezing cold. Now, at that point, we really have got, as it were, to the top of our hill, the top of our story. We've set up the background, we've given more details, we've hinted towards the problem, and then we have expressed the problem. The nations want peace. The Xiongnu want to arrange a marriage to bring about peace. But, as you can imagine, no one wants to go and marry the Xiongnu leader. And then, finally, we bring in our main character. Then, Wang Zhaojun volunteered to do so for the sake of ending her people's suffering. And at this point, we can really say we're now on the downward slope of the story. We're now getting towards the resolution. Let's keep going. Emperor Yuan admired her courage and was thankful for her willingness to serve the interests of the Han in spite of her own interests. So with those previous sentences, we've had the problem, we've had the main character who, because of her own personality and strength and courage, is able to resolve the problem. And now we deal with some concluding things about the story. Let's listen to the next sentence. After Zhao Jun married the Xiongnu leader, she got on perfectly well with the people and introduced the civilization of the Central Plain to them. And finally, we get to the happy ending of this story. As a result, peace reigned on the border with her mother country for over half a century. So what you can see, in just a few sentences, I've managed to convey a lot of necessary information about this story. I've conveyed a bit about the background, I've talked about the problem, I've introduced the main character, I've talked about how this problem was solved, and then I've talked about the long-term impacts of this story, because a lot of these Chinese stories we're going to be sharing with you are not just stories that stand alone. They resonate throughout the ages. They play an important part in the values and the worldview of Chinese people. And so if you can learn how to tell this story in this succinct way to foreigners, it will be of huge benefit. Let's listen to the story one more time, right from the beginning. I'm going to, from the first sentence to the last sentence, just read it all the way through. Okay, so let's now listen to the whole text. During the Western Han Dynasty, there was constant warfare between the Han and the Xiongnu. In order to coexist peacefully, the Xiongnu leader, Kan Huhanye, asked Emperor Yuan to marry one of his daughters. The emperor agreed to this request, but instead of his daughter, he planned to choose a palace maid to marry the Xiongnu leader. However, no one was willing to go to a foreign land which was far away and freezing cold. Then, Wang Zhaojun volunteered to do so for the sake of ending her people's suffering. Emperor Yuan admired her courage and was thankful for her willingness to serve the interests of the Han in spite of her own interests. After Zhao Jun married the Xiongnu leader, she got on perfectly well with the people and introduced the civilization of the Central Plain to them. As a result, peace reigned on the border with her mother country for over half a century. Okay, so that's it for today's program. In the next class, as I said before, you'll be diving back into the text from the book, and my colleague will be taking you in great detail through the text, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. But in this class, you've learnt how to tell this whole story in just 3 or 4 seconds. Okay, bye for now.